Good afternoon and welcome to this special report from the Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey, the politics and accountability anchor. Coming up, we'll talk with reporters who are on the front lines telling the stories of COVID-19. But first, here are some of the latest news stories that we're watching. Rick Bright, a former top U.S. vaccine official, told Congress today that he raised concerns about the shortage of medical materials, but the Department of Health and Human Services did not respond. He also cast doubt on President Trump's statements of how quickly a vaccine could be available. Britain has approved an antibody test from Roche, calling it an extremely reliable way to see who's already had the coronavirus. And a new report shows that people speaking at just an ordinary volume can produce small respiratory droplets that stay in the air for at least 8 minutes. And this could explain why there are so many clusters of cases from conferences or choir practices, places where folks are in confined spaces. Well, my first guest today is Jon Gerberg, a video journalist who I get to work with at the Washington Post. Jon, it's so good to see you.
Hey, you too, Libby. Good to see you.
So Jon is always behind the camera. He's running the camera, he's asking people questions, and then he's editing and putting together videos, as well as writing stories for the Washington Post. So it's a privilege to get to see you on this side of the camera, Jon. I want to hear about your reporting because you spent a month in New York reporting from a Brooklyn hospital, really on the front lines. You also did a ride along with a New York City transit bus driver. So I want to start with the story of the bus driver. Tell us about who you rode along with. We'll watch some footage from your piece while you talk to us about her.
Oh, sure. Yeah. That was Sandra Crawford that I spent a day with on a shift. She's been a bus driver in Brooklyn for 17 years. And this, like everybody else's life in the pandemic, her job is really different now. So we just wanted to kind of get a sense with that story of the real risk that bus drivers, like many essential workers, are taking every day just to kind of keep the city running and, keep themselves safe and the people they're serving safe, but also, keep the city, moving day to day.
We just saw an image of two of her colleagues their photos were on a board. Those are two colleagues that have died from coronavirus.
Yep. Yeah, that was just in the depot, the Jackie Gleason depot in Brooklyn where she worked. She had two colleagues die, and their pictures are up on the wall. So every day they go in, and every driver you talk to, they're very aware of the real risks that are involved in this work now, especially if you're older or you have a comorbidity, if you're predisposed to be more vulnerable to this disease, which a lot of drivers are, frankly. So they're taking all that into account.
So tell me about Sandra's life. Like, what was she worried about in terms of catching coronavirus or passing it along to family members?
Sure. Yeah, her biggest thing, she has her and her son, who's 17 years old, are both asthmatic. So she's a bit worried about that. Her son, cutely enough, seemed to be in a lot of ways more worried about it than she was. Actually, he's actually, since school is all remote now, he's almost not leaving. They have they have a small apartment in East New York, Brooklyn, and he's barely going outside at all. And that when she comes home, she's pretty good about, taking off her, her outer layer and, cleaning her keys, and like a familiar sight for a lot of people these days. She has the cleaning supplies all over the place, and is kind of trying to take every precaution, especially when she first gets home, to shower and clean her supplies and just not be passing it along to her family. She also lives with her fiance, Mario. And they talk about...
Sandra described her son as almost wearing like an old man. Like he's so wise beyond his years and was sort of nagging her and bugging her because he's worried about her.
Totally. 100%. Yeah. And that's the interesting dynamic about this whole pandemic, I think, is everybody's kind of, you're worried about yourself, but you're almost more worried about the people you love and the people in your community. And so much of it is kind of watching out for who's next. And I think you kind of see that both in her work, and the way, her job every day is to take care of people and to get people safely to where they need to go. But in order to do that, she also needs to take care of herself. So you saw that both in her job and when she takes that home at the end of the day.
So who's riding the bus? I mean, at the point that you were talking to her a little while back, who was still taking the bus?
You know, at the time, you know, in New York, it was and still is supposed to be just essential workers that are taking public transportation, um, and that was mostly that. You know, everybody I talked to was on their way to a job. I talked to people that were grocery workers, health workers. You do see a lot of people in scrubs going to work at various hospitals. You know, cleaning workers, people that worked in rehabs and other facilities like that. Um, but there's also, you know, there's nobody actually kind of checking your ID when you get on the bus. There is a certain honor system to it. And at the same time, Sandra did kind of, you know, she expresses, you know, she's not there to kind of police people, right? And sometimes, you know, you might see somebody who's, you know, she might have questions about whether they're there as an essential worker or not, but she's also not going to, you know, confront somebody like that, you know? So she was very kind of grateful and supportive for all the people. Again, like a lot of us have become increasingly, you know, appreciative of all the hardworking people that keep our societies going. And she was really honored to kind of be a part of that and to keep the essential workers getting to work every day. In a way, she's an essential worker to the essential workers, right? Because none of them could do that essential work without something seemingly as simple as a bus driver. So those are the kind of people I talk to on the bus. There's an area where the way they have it set up on the New York City buses, which I believe are a lot of different cities are doing this now too, but the front area by the driver is all kind of sectioned off. What's normally kind of the reserved seating section is completely roped off unless there's somebody with a disability that needs to get in there. So I was able to kind of walk to that barrier and talk to people, but even I had a little bit of a distance between the general public on the bus.
How are you keeping yourself safe while reporting that story, Jon?
There's a whole regiment of these kind of things, and again, you know, you're more trying to take care of yourself just to make sure you are, you know, doing everything you can for all the other people that you're talking to. But you know, it's everything from, you know, from wearing a mask and gloves at all times, wiping down all my gear with, you know, antibacterial wipes before and after every shoot. You know, every time that I would get back to the apartment that I was subletting, I would remove all my outer layer, at least put it in a trash bag and get that right in the laundry, get right in the shower before I do anything. And when you're out there, you know, on the bus, for instance, I kind of, you know, my rental car had kind of become this like roving, you know, decontamination station. So as soon as I open my trunk, I've got, you know, my wipes, my sprays, my disinfectant, you know, my hand sanitizer, my contractor bags that everything can go in. I've got layers of clothes. So honestly, like before I even get in my car, I can like change clothes and, you know, so I'm not even bringing that into the car. Again, I'm like wiping down all my gear before it even goes back into the car. It gets old, especially like for a video journalist, right? You're like, you know, I always joke that my job is half just like a video gear donkey. Like you're just carrying around tons of gear all the time. And so that can get really tedious when you have to like decontaminate that twice for every shoot. But you know, these are kind of extraordinary times. So that's all just kind of part, not to mention then you're also keeping your distance from the people you're talking to and interviewing, and you know, little things like if it's outside
That's so
trying to
strange.
like
Yeah, but that's so strange because like part of what you do as a journalist, you're trying to like make a real connection with someone, and eye contact is a lot of what goes into that, like showing them that you're a good listener. And I imagine that all is just a different experience while you're wearing a mask and,
100%.
staying far away and staying far away.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think especially with video journalism, I mean, I think our strongest reporting is when it's about human connection and being able to kind of get not into just somebody's like life, but into somebody's head and see how this looks and sounds and feels to live somebody else's life, you know, and it's harder to do that from a distance. And um, you know, in some ways, interestingly though, so many of our stories now, like so much of the story is about that distance and that loneliness and that disconnection. So sometimes I think like the aesthetic of being farther away actually it documents that exact reality that is part of the story that we are telling right now. Um, but it's definitely a challenge both on a technical level of just like how do I get good sound and how do I get a good image, but exactly as you're saying, like how do I connect with this person and build trust and and really just get an honest take of where are you at and how are we getting through this.
One of the stories you reported early on in this sort of stay at home and social distance phase was a story about the challenges for people who are in addiction recovery right now and
Mm.
what they're facing. People who rely on community, maybe who act as a sponsor for someone else, or who like to go to meetings to be with people who can share their experiences. You profiled one man who's 18 years sober. What was he struggling with as all of these sort of lockdowns and stay at home orders really kicked in?
Yeah, sure. His name was Peter Bergen, and yeah, he had been a long time sober, and he was struggling with in some ways, the same things we all are, and especially people in recovery are, which is staying connected. He had been going to recovery groups for 18 years, and so much, what has worked for some, we wanted to focus on the recovery community in this case because, you know, as human connection is kind of being hit across the board during the pandemic, this is a community that has really found a way to survive through human connection, right? And for generations, addiction recovery groups of all kinds have kind of built a somewhat, a sustainable, functional, working way to cope with addiction through that very, it's all built on human connection. It's all built on coming together. And all of a sudden you're looking at a situation where people can't meet in person, can't have those same contacts, can't have that reaffirmation that we're going through this together in the same way. Um, but Peter was reaching out to everyone he could. I mean, he has a pretty good social media presence, so he was, both people that he's, already friends with and kind of reaching out to new people and expanding his network, making new friends online. That was a big part for him, and also just kind of redoubling his efforts to connect with family and friends, by phone calls and by, just kind of taking that extra liberty, which I even know in my own life, like I feel like I have more of a license to like call my old buddies and be like, hey, what's up? What are you doing? Like, I know you're there. Pick up the phone. So he's doing a lot of that too. Just, trying to, at its core, stay connected any way
And
possible.
one of the challenges he's facing that so many are facing is he lost his jobs. Like he had a couple different sources of income and they dried up. John, you also visited a church here in DC that's was not having worship services or community events, but the thing they were staying open for was to allow recovery groups to continue meeting in their space. Why did that church make that decision, and how were they trying to kind of make it as safe as possible?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they had their whole philosophy to it was, you know, they wanted to allow every group that was using their space to make their own decisions, and especially in the case of recovery groups that have always kind of found a safe harbor in their, in their facilities. um, they recognized how important connection was to that group and wanted to be able to provide it as long as the people participating in that deemed it safe and effective. So at the time, they were allowing the groups to still use their facilities, and they were doing their own cleaning and, at night going and sanitizing the space and also leaving extra sanitation supplies out, and encouraging the groups to use it themselves. And they had at that point made the decision to stop holding services themselves, but they also kind of recognize the need and, the value in other groups being able to come together if at all possible.
Mm. While you were based in New York for a month, reporting, as you mentioned, staying in a sublet, really staying there for a concentrated amount of time, you did a story about what it's like in a Brooklyn hospital on a shift. And this was a hospital that had just been overrun with coronavirus cases. Tell us about the hospital and what the medical staff was facing.
Sure. Yeah, we spent a whole day at Maimonides Medical Center, which is in Brooklyn, and that was actually kind of during the real peak of the pandemic, at least as we've seen so far. Um, and it was a lot. We were in multiple intensive care units that were completely overrun. One was entirely COVID patients. Another one was almost entirely. Um, and nurses were kind of having to learn on the fly and really kind of change their tactics in completely new ways. One thing you saw kind of immediately when you walked into the ICUs, where you see all these monitors and IV bags that are kind of on these hangers that you're used to seeing bedside, right, when a patient's in the ICU. Now you saw all those kind of spilled out into the hallways. And they had that done because, every time a nurse goes in to treat a COVID patient, they have to don new protective gear, right? You hear about the PPE all the time now and how much of a shortage that was. And, so that's masks and gloves and face masks and gowns. But every time you use that could potentially be contaminated and they have to, get rid of it. So they were moving all the monitors and bags into the hallways so that they could kind of keep monitoring everybody without having to burn up all that PPE, which is really valuable, especially at that time. But again, that really did present a lot of challenges for nurses to be able to do their job. Specifically, as we're kind of talking about with the addiction story too, the importance of human connection is also really key in nursing and healing and treatment, right? And all the nurses we talked to spoke about how so much of their job originally is to be there for the patient, in the same way we're talking about, like to actually establish a connection with the patient, with their family, to be that kind of bridge. And all of a sudden they're in a place where now they have to stay outside the glass, where they're actually taking measures to stay away from their patient, to keep barricades between them. So that was really hard, both on a functional level, when you see somebody like Janet Perez, one of the nurses, who every time she goes in and out, she has to rip off her gown and, change up all her gear. It takes up a lot more time. But also on a kind of an emotional level, to know that, they were not, at that point, New York had already stopped allowing visitors in the ICUs until absolute end of life circumstances. So that was hard on an emotional level for the nurses to really see how, patients were literally dying alone right in front of them. And that's not an easy thing for anybody to deal with even once, let alone, to spend days and weeks on end seeing that nonstop. And that's exactly
To
what.
give a sense of it, yeah, to give a sense of the scale of this, you reported that more than 80% of the 600 adult patients who were there were infected with coronavirus. They were seeing this on a massive scale. And that nurse you mentioned, Janet, told you this is a battlefield and we've turned ourselves from nurses into soldiers. But she also really emphasized that this is what she signed up to help people. Like, she signed up to do this job. So there was a sense of resilience and determination in these doctors and nurses you talked to.
Absolutely. It's what kept them going. The sleepless hours and the just relentless days and days on end, and the overtime shifts, and and you have other staff, there's understaffing issues, right? Because other people either are getting sick or are preemptively realizing that they have to stay back again, because they're worried about spreading the disease if they might be sick, if they might be a little feverish. But then you end up with understaffing. So you also had the nurses at Maimonides were working double the amount of patients that they normally had in a lot of cases. So that also becomes exhausting. And if you don't have hope, if you don't have something to hold on to there, you're not going to last long. So people like Janet, where, they would all gather for group prayer every morning before they go, and they kept in it. So.
I'd like to welcome our colleague Whitney Leaming to the conversation, also a video journalist who's behind a camera, interviewing people, editing pieces, and now we get to see you in person, Whitney. You also have been reporting on medical professionals. You reported from a Chicago hospital. Did what you see and report on there line up with what Jon's saying in terms of just how the doctors and nurses were kind of coping with this and what was so hard for them about this moment?
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, the emotional toll that this is taking on healthcare professionals is really the same across the board. I was at Rush Medical Center on the west side of Chicago, which is a hospital very different than most hospitals in the U.S. because it was actually built to handle things like a deadly pandemic. So in a lot of ways, they were really well prepared and fortunate because this is what they were designed for and have run drills after drill in order to handle.
And it's just so fascinating though, because even though they've been prepared for like a biohazard incident or some sort of like mass incidents, like it was all happening at once, right? You've got both this idea that you have a lot of people coming in, and also that you need to be very aware of contamination. It's not as tragic as like a mass shooting would be, or some kind of a natural disaster. It has a different level of awareness of contamination and everything else. So how were they dealing with both those things at the same time?
Yeah, so they've thought this through so well. They had gone into, I think they had gotten their first COVID positive patient, and 11 days later had gone into complete surge mode, which involved changing the ambulance bay into a kind of an intake center where patients who thought they might have COVID would come in, get tested, and then from there they would move into the emergency department, which, unlike most emergency rooms in the country, these rooms, instead of having bays with curtains, are actually individual rooms with heavy glass doors that can have negative pressure. So like you saw in Jon's video where the nurses are coming in and out of these glass doors, that's the same in their ER as it is in their ICU. So they would take in severe patients who are having problems into the emergency department. And then once they got to a stage where they needed to go into critical care, they would then be moved into an ICU COVID unit. So they had this really down pat and moved from room to room. So while they had to be, in complete protective gear with the N95 mask and gowns and those type of things, they were actually dealing in almost anywhere inside the hospital where they were dealing with negative pressure rooms, which really provides an extra sense of safety and fights against airborne diseases.
It's incredible. Before we let Jon go, I'd just like to hear from both of you about what it's like to report from a hospital in particular in this moment. The nurses and doctors and others are sort of trained in how to take care of themselves, protect themselves, use PPE. But how did both of you make sure that you were following sort of those same rigorous standards and keeping both yourselves safe and the medical staff safe? And what was it like to be seeing patients in these really tough moments? We'll start with you, Whitney.
Yeah, it's, like Jon said, one of our biggest fears is actually us bringing in and infecting anyone else that we're going to cover. And so I had actually just come off of 2 weeks of quarantine to make sure that I was really safe. I hadn't come in contact. And so that was my biggest concern going in. I was extremely safe on my way there. And then once I was inside the hospital, I talked to administrators about the best ways to be prepared. I came in with gear. They also did temperature checks and things like that. But after that point, I kind of took their lead, and we wore masks and didn't touch a lot of things. But when I was actually shooting, my biggest concern was just not interfering or getting in the way with what the doctors and nurses were working on. So after I think I tend to figure out and worry about logistics and protection beforehand, and then during it, it's just doing your job and staying out of people's way.
Jon?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what Whitney said too. I mean, I think we approach it the same way, and in the same way that when in a lot of situations, this is like my mantra. But you ask the experts, and we're lucky to be right there working with people who know who know. So as much as you can, right? Because we all are kind of learning on the fly with this pandemic too. But don't try to kind of get ahead of your skis, and just ask the doctors. And yes, you don't want to kind of get in their way too much, but if you're asking the kind of basic, just to make sure that you're staying out of the way, but not contaminating the space in any way, I think that's the best way you can do it. And interestingly, like, not to freak anybody out or anything, but I talk to doctors who would even say, I'm more comfortable here in the ICU once I'm in than when I go to the grocery store, because at least in the ICU, everybody there is very, diligent about wearing their PPE and following the protocols, and it's actually out there, as soon as I, go out into Midwood, Brooklyn, that like everybody's out there, not actually suited up. And so that level of risk is a bit relative when you're talking about a situation like this. But I think the biggest thing you can do, and this is just like a journalistic practice, is like defer to the experts, know the limits of your own knowledge, and learn as you go. And first, do no harm whenever possible. So.
Well, Jon, thank you so much. We're going to let you go.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Whitney, Jon was just talking about that contradiction the medical professionals were seeing between how they were trying to be so careful in the hospital and then going out into the rest of the world where the rest of us are, with perhaps not as much knowledge and education about how to be safe. You interviewed a paramedic in Yonkers, New York. And to remind everybody, Yonkers is one of the areas that was hit so bad early in New York, where some of the first outbreaks happened. And the paramedic seemed a little frustrated that he was working so hard to like try to keep family members safe and save people's lives, and then that other people outside of his sphere just weren't bothering with social distancing and weren't taking this seriously enough.
Yeah, I mean, when I was with AJ and Empress Emergency Services, it was just at the very beginning of the down curve that they were starting to see in New York. And so a lot of people, you could start to see, were coming out into the streets and relaxing a lot more. And it was also about the time where people across the country were getting a little frustrated with social distancing and not working and all the problems that creates. But at the same time, they're still going on multiple calls a day where patients are likely COVID positive, and they're putting themselves in very tight spaces with these people. And they're constantly exposed to it. So it's a little hard for them to then see people being very cavalier about their safety and about other people's safety. And it really puts everyone at risk.
So give us a sense of how many calls and what kinds of calls AJ and his team were getting.
Mm-hmm. So I spent on the day that I did the first day with AJ and his team, we went on about 5 or 6 calls, most of which were likely COVID specific calls. But this, while to me was a lot, was actually a huge downward spiral for them. Like, they hadn't been seeing so many cases. I think at one point AJ had told me that they had seen something like the same amount of cardiac arrest that they usually see in a month, they were seeing in 24 hours. And the amount of resuscitations or intubations they do, in 3 to 4 months, they were doing in 24-hour periods. So it was just one after another. And I don't think up to that point, AJ had actually taken a day off when I saw him the first time since this entire kind of crisis had started.
What were the paramedics coping with in terms of just like the emotions of it and like the relentless nature of this?
I think I've heard this across the board with all the different EMTs I hung out with, and even the doctors and nurses we talked to, is right now they're kind of in like work mode where they're used to dealing with death and with extreme illness, but they're not used to dealing at this scale. And while it is very scary and exhausting work, I think the real fear for them is when this kind of really starts to slow down and they have a chance to process what they've seen and what they've done. And everything else that will kind of come to surface as things slow down for them.
What was it like for you to do these ride-alongs? I mean, you talk about the ambulance and even some of the homes that you were showing the EMTs go into were very small, confined spaces, taking a patient down like a walking set of stairs, and then being in the back of that crowded, cramped ambulance. We've got to be very aware of everyone staying safe, and you got your video camera rolling this whole time.
Yeah, I mean, it was a little nerve-wracking in the beginning. It's I never actually done ride-alongs with EMTs before this had happened, but I kind of took my cues from them with where I could go, how safe I was, and I kind of judged my distance off of, if I am in their way, am I getting too close? I tried to keep some distance from patients, but I was in the same rooms, but I took the precautions that the EMTs had told me to follow and was careful about it. But it was also, I felt important to go in and really see this and be able to show it firsthand.
So Whitney, you've traveled a lot for work. You covered Zika in Brazil. You also covered Ebola in Liberia. How do those experiences compare to now reporting on a pandemic in your own country?
Yeah, I think that's the weirdest part about it is that this is in my own country. Ebola was my first international assignment and my first infectious disease assignment. And so it was a very new experience for me, and it's a very different type of disease. I think the difference in covering this now in the States is that I'm not personally in high risk category, but because it's airborne and symptoms often don't show up, I never know if I'm going to infect someone else. And I think that's the most nerve-wracking part. And it's also just, at the same time, when I'm covering things in other places or assignments that don't directly affect my family, it's easier to focus on the story and on the people I'm working with. It's a little harder when you are worried also in the back of your mind about your parents and your brothers and your roommates and things like that as well. But it's all been a very new and interesting experience that we're learning from.
Well, Whitney, I learned so much by watching your videos because it really does feel like you're there and it feels so firsthand and so immediate. So thank you for what you've been doing and thanks for telling us about it.
All right, thank you.
I want to say hi to Cleve Wootson, national political reporter who was just minding his business covering a presidential campaign when this pandemic started. So Cleve, make sure you're unmuted so I can hear you. Cleve, you left DC and like some of our other colleagues have been on the road traveling, covering the pandemic. So where are you now?
Now I am in Brunswick. I have to think about it. Now I'm in Brunswick, Georgia. I'm covering the shooting of Ahmaud Arbery, which was before that I was kind of stationed in Florida doing that. But I've been traversing the Florida-Georgia line for a while now, just writing on COVID back and forth.
So, as you've been in these southern states, how have you been tracking the decisions to open? Georgia is a state that we've all been watching so closely because the governor of Georgia was slow to close things down and then the first to reopen and try to get businesses back up and running.
Yeah, so you can get a haircut in Georgia, which is like uncalled for in other places and all of that stuff. So, a lot of what I've been trying to do before places reopened was try to get into people's heads about whether it makes sense, whether the risk was worth it to reopen. And then as states kind of begin to decide that, yes, it is worth reopening, then you go and talk to the people who are on the front lines or who are in those stores and all of that stuff. And what I found, almost universally is that a lot of folks kind of want other people to be the guinea pigs. You guys go out first, you go into the world first, and then, I'll go to the mall and the barbershop and the restaurant later.
You profiled a salon in Waycross. So how are they doing? What were the decisions like for the people who work in that salon? Because we've all talked about how there are some businesses where it's easier to social distance, but a salon is a occupation where you're really close physically to your customers.
Yeah, one of the most interesting thing was listening to them talk on the phone because they would interview their customers before they came in, and they sounded like ER admittance nurses. They'd be like, do you have a fever? And have you been coughing? And are you willing to wear a mask? And all, and then, oh, what kind of color do you want? Which was just super interesting. When I was interviewing the owner, I went through my notes and the recording, and half of it, every couple of minutes, it's like, hey, make sure you're wearing a mask, or make sure you're wearing gloves, and all of that stuff. It's just this hyper vigilance because they can't be distant. You can't be distant when you're literally running your fingers through somebody's hair, and so they're both wanting to make money and to pay their rent and pay their car payment, but like realize that not only are they some of the first people going back to work in the retail sector, but also that like they can't keep any distance from the people they're supposed to be serving.
So what about restaurants? What were you seeing and hearing? What have you been seeing and hearing from restaurants that have been reopening, or restaurant owners wrestling with the decision whether or not they should?
Sure. Like, so Georgia opened a little earlier than Florida. A lot of places, just driving by, you'll see that they've put up signs, and I'm not talking professional, made signs. It's like a Waffle House with a handmade sign that says, "We're open. Please call. Please come in and get some waffles," and all of that stuff. And then inside the restaurants, when you peek in, most are doing a pretty brisk takeout business, like everywhere else. But a lot of people, even when you can dine in, aren't really willing to take the risk of going in, because once you sit down, you're really at the mercy of whomever comes in, right? You can't just get up and leave without paying your tab or whatever. And so a lot of people aren't really willing to. So most restaurants are open at like 25% capacity or 50% capacity, or opening up outside, so that you have some space and some air and all of that stuff. But I haven't seen a packed, completely full place in some time.
You did a story 1 week ago from Sarasota, Florida, and it showed the real contrast of this moment. At one end of this parking lot is a coronavirus testing facility, and at the other end was a mall that was opening for the first time in weeks. So let's first talk about the mall. Like, who was going in? What were they doing there? What were they thinking about?
I mean, the only thing I didn't see in the mall were tumbleweeds, right? I mean, there were so few people at this mall. It was actually quite sad because all the stores are open and the lights are, and just nobody there. There were some mall walkers. There were some people that came in just because they've been stuck in the house for 6 weeks and wanted to get out of the house and go somewhere. And I talked to one elderly couple. I think they were like in their 70s or 80s. And I said, what brought you out to to the mall? And she said, well, my wedding ring broke. And I had to come to the jeweler to get it fixed. So we're running in, we're dashing out, we're trying to be in and out as soon as possible. So it's the mall is open because it can open, right? Because the governor said they could and all of that stuff. But the business owners are extremely wary. The shoppers are even more wary. And one of the hard things about this mall was that in order to get in, you had to first drive past this COVID testing facility, which is a blade, which was rocking, which sold out, not sold out, but ran out of tests, within 2 hours of opening. So there's this like vivid sign of just how serious the virus is right next to this like happy shopping mecca.
Mm. You also talked to a Florida farmer who sadly said that his cucumber crop this year might be the best that he's ever had. And he had no place to send it to market. He was really struggling to figure out just what to do with it. So, what was he facing, and how was he dealing with the crop?
Yeah, so I mean, he put it quite vividly. Once he put those seeds into the ground, there's nothing that you can do to stop them from growing, to stop them from coming at a certain point in time. And the issue is coronavirus has shut down food chains up and down the East Coast. His cucumbers become pickles, and the pickle company is closed. And it's not just a matter of him losing acres upon acres of crops, which is a tragedy in and of itself. But this round of crops, this harvest pays for seeds for next time and pays the mortgage and pays the workers. And if you can't do that, I mean, he just broke down this line for me. This farm has been open since 1963. It may not be here next year. And I think a lot of farmers are facing that. Not just, it's really bad that we don't have anywhere to send these crops for the most part, but also like these crops pay the bills. And if we don't have these crops, that's another family farm that's gone forever.
Mm. Um, Cleve, I'd like to welcome two of our other guests to the show. We've got Lee Powell, video journalist, and also Robert Ray, contributor to the Washington Post and a video journalist. Robert, you've also been talking to, farmers, people who are used to being able to get their produce, their product, their animals to market, and they're just struggling and figuring out what to do. Who have you been talking to, Robert?
Yeah, I've talked to dairy farmers, cattle ranchers, people that work at meat packing industries, all the way from Alabama to Arizona to Nebraska. And indeed, the supply chain that you were talking about just a second ago is fractured, and it's fractured because the way all of this product is created from a ranch or a dairy farm and then pushed out to either a grocery store or a restaurant are two separate things. I mean, the way that they produce those and package them and the flow of interstate traffic or train, the way it all gets to places is very different. And so the business model is not working correctly because frankly they've never experienced anything like this. So what I continue to hear out there in the field from the meat packing plants to the ranchers to the dairy farmers to the produce guy is that a reinvention or reimagination of the industry needs to occur. Innovation is essentially the bottom line here.
Cleve, the farmers that you were talking to were trying to get their produce to people in need, to people who were hungry. And they actually said, this was a bit heartbreaking, that a story was done about how they were having to plow some of their crop back into the land, and they were getting hate mail from people upset about the waste. And they were like, we are doing everything we can to try to get our food to those in need. What were they doing, and what's the food bank situation like in Central Florida?
Yeah, the farmer Hank Scott told me about the hate mail, and Scott told me, if I was able to, I would give all of my food to a food bank instead of plowing it under. But the food banks, they're not set up in a way that they can take millions of pounds of cucumbers all of a sudden. They have finite space. Their refrigerators are only so large. And so, there's certain groups that will recruit volunteers, go out to farms, pick vegetables, take care of all of that sort of food chain stuff and get it into the hands of needy families. And there's definitely a need because food lines are reporting their longest, their longest lines ever, the biggest need and all of that stuff. But it's just such an overwhelming. Hank Scott sells cucumbers that end up, as pickles in restaurants up and down the Eastern Seaboard and all of Disney and all of that stuff. And so, even if he gave it away, it would just overwhelm and inundate. And so the greater majority of it just goes to waste.
All right. Well, Cleve Wootson, thank you so much for your reporting. We're glad to get to talk with you. Stay safe out there, and we'll check in with you again soon. Thanks, Cleve. Robert and Lee, so good to see both of you. Lee, you've been reporting on flying, and you had some incredible footage and we'll see in just a moment, where you showed us what an airport looked like before this all really kicked in and what it looks like now. So tell us about the footage that we're checking out right here.
Well, good to be with you, Libby. The background behind this footage, kind of this before to basically this was shot last week at the Atlanta airport, is I've been working on a larger project for much of last year about the airline industry, in that these were kind of the best of times for them after so many years of struggle. And so I had actually spent some time at the Atlanta airport, in and around the airport, just gathering footage for this other project. And when I had to go to Mississippi, in fact, when we were with you last to cover the primary there back in March, I gathered some more footage and then just sort of came back and looked at what I had and realized, we could do some nice contrast scenes inside and outside the terminal and the airport there about how things kind of were then and how things are now. So what you're seeing is, some footage from actually June of last year, kind of at the height of the summer travel season, the busiest time for the airlines, and then from March 11th, coming back from Mississippi, and then last week. So a mix, but you kind of get the sense that this is the world's busiest airport, and things are definitely not as busy as they once were by any stretch.
Well, Robert, I know you must be very familiar with this airport in particular, with the Atlanta airport in particular. I just want to point out, Robert, that you've been on the road for like 7 weeks and you've driven over 6,000 miles, reporting from 19 states for the Washington Post, telling stories from all over the country. So you mostly been in your car, but you did just fly up to Michigan. So what was it like to fly in this new era?
Yeah. Michigan is state number 20, and it's. I got to be honest with you. Yesterday was interesting because I had flown about 3 weeks ago on a one-way trip because I had left my vehicle in Phoenix, Arizona, because I needed to get back to Atlanta for the opening of Georgia, and there's no way I could traverse the nearly 2,000 miles in 2 days. So I left my vehicle there. So I flew back and there was no one on that flight at that point. Probably, gosh, I think 11, 12 people. The flight to Lansing, Michigan yesterday was twofold. It was up to Detroit and then to Lansing. And it was about, I would guesstimate 70-75% full. And so, you have 3 seats on one side of the aisle, 3 on the other. And what they were doing is putting us, a window and an aisle, no one in the center. And everyone had the mask on. That was new for me because 3 weeks ago when I had done a one-way flight, that didn't exist. But now it's mandatory when you get on the plane. There's no beverage service. There's no, food or anything like that. And everything is quite sterile. But it feels fairly clean because I think that those planes have been taken care of, very exclusively as far as the washdowns and the sanitation. So right now it felt okay. It felt good. I got my normal nap in.
Okay, Lee, tell us more about your recent experience flying. And you had a great photo that we'll show too.
I kind of retraced my steps from this last trip where it took me from Washington's Dulles Airport to Atlanta and then back in March on to Jackson, Mississippi. I only went as far as Atlanta this time, pretty much the same flight, almost the same times. The plane was probably, I would guess, 12, 17 people on the flight. The vast majority of them actually were flight crew, not just working that flight, but people that were deadheading as they do in the industry to their next flight to other cities. And so those folks all have to kind of move around to get in place for where their next flight is. But as you can see from this footage, the thing that struck me the most is it was just dark. Once we took off, once they killed the lights, because all the shades had been drawn down, and since no one was sitting in so many of those sections, no one raised the window shade, so you were basically flying in darkness in the middle of the day, and that was the experience both coming and going.
And didn't they give you like all of your like snack pack accoutrements and stuff like in one little bag?
They did, and this is actually what you're seeing right now. Is the flight attendants came down the aisle very quickly and had everything in a Ziploc bag that they handed to you with a little bit of water, a few snacks, and of course that ubiquitous hand sanitizer. And this is really most of the airlines are doing this if they're doing service at all. Some are not at all, but the few that are packaging everything together like this to basically minimize the amount of time that the flight attendants are in the aisle serving passengers, exposing themselves to passengers. And so, of course, you'll see, nothing is in an open glass in terms of a beverage or an open can. It's all very sealed and in one package that they can go down very quickly and just hand off and then kind of go back to their seats. They were also on that flight, as you saw, they were blocking lots of that had 3 seats, an aisle, and 2 seats. So they had blocked the middle seats and then one of the aisles on the side with 2 seats. They had also blocked big chunks of seats in the front and in the back around where the flight attendants have their jump seats and have to sit. Again, to minimize that contact between passengers and flight crew, not because they're, trying to stay away from people, and in a way they kind of are. They just want to protect their employees who, have to basically, this is their job, flying place to place. And if they get sick, they're going to have a problem, potentially staffing those flights.
So Lee, as you've been doing this deep dive project into the airline industry, the story has just turned so severely right now. And we just got word that Delta plans to retire its Boeing 777 fleet because of COVID-19, the CEO is saying. So, Lee, what are you watching for from the industry now?
Well, I did spend a lot of last year inside airlines, inside airports, talking to people that work and fly and follow the industry. And you're right. Today Delta did announce that they're pulling their largest plane, the 777, out of service later this year. And that's the kind of plane that you would fly the longest routes. Talking Atlanta to like Johannesburg, South Africa, Atlanta to Tokyo, and they clearly just don't see that international travel coming back. And some analysts I've talked to say that market may not bounce back to the levels it was until 2 to 3 years from now. And so, what you're going to probably see is when these restrictions do start to lift and people do start to get out, you're going to see everything happen in waves. You're going to probably see, interestingly enough, a lot of leisure travel. Once places like Disney open up, Las Vegas, they think there's going to be a lot of pent up demand. People just want to get out of the house and go on a trip to those kind of vacation spots. You're going to see a lot of vacation travelers. It's also the summer too. The next is probably you're going to see business travel come back, but that's only going to be when companies start sending people out on the road and don't communicate like we're doing right now through the web. And then last year, we're going to see that long haul overseas travel happen. But again, that's going to be a while. And so, the airlines are in a very, very difficult spot right now because they have gotten some funding from the government, about $50 billion, to basically pay people, keep people working through September. And so the thinking is that if things don't pick up by October 1st, you're probably going to see massive layoffs and a massive downsizing of the airline industry. I've heard probably close to 30% of the industry of people could lose their jobs. And so everything's going to shrink down. It's possible that some airlines may not make it. You probably won't see any of the big four, the Southwest, Americans, Delta, Uniteds, go out of business. They will be much smaller. But beyond that, it's kind of a guess who makes it and in what kind of form. And so the challenge for the airlines now is, they've gotten this funding. They have to actually just keep flying and maintain service across their network. And what that really means is, maybe they flew 5 or 6 times, like DC to Los Angeles. They only have one flight a day now, but they have to keep things moving. But then once that date comes when that funding kind of lapses, you're probably going to see a big shrink and a lot of people being let go. And I'll leave you with this last thing is, the challenge of the airlines is that they have all these fixed costs. They have all these planes. They have all these people they have to pay for to keep things moving when, demand is basically like dropped by 95%. So it's almost zero. But they have all these costs that they still have to cover. And so, they're basically, burning through cash. To take the example of Delta, they say that they're burning through about $50 million a day just to keep their airline operating. And so even though they parked, about 650 planes out of about 860 of their fleet. So those costs, that's not sustainable in the long term. You can't run an airline burning through $50 million a day in cash because eventually you're just going to run out of cash. And so, they're hoping that things start to open up, things will pick up, people will get back on planes, maybe later this summer, maybe later into the fall, but not nearly the levels that it was even, the beginning of March.
All right, Lee Powell, I especially appreciate you talking about through the projections of what travel might happen first and second and third, because it's something that I haven't heard many people talk about, but you've certainly been reporting on and looking into. So, Lee, thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing what you do next.
Thank you.
All right. So, Robert, okay, you're in your 20th state in Michigan. This morning, you were covering a protest. People who are upset and concerned about Democrat Governor Whitmer's directives, her decisions about staying at home. What was the protest like this morning?
About 300 people. Unfortunately, it was pouring rain. So the protest was supposed to go on for about 3-4 hours, lasted about an hour and a half. One thing that did occur this morning is there was a group of people, small albeit, but that came with some very bad intentions. One person brought a noose, another person brought an axe. You know, the rhetoric online over the past few weeks had been calling for the assassination of the governor. Some people have been saying. Some people have been saying, drag her out of the building, we'll tie her up to a tree. And I don't need to be as graphic as I'm being, but that's the reality of the situation on the ground at this protest. Now, having said that, it's not everyone at the protest acting like that, but there is a group of people, an armed militia that was there that had, AK-47s, AR-15s, handguns. Many of the people that I went up to told me that they were not locked and loaded. Of course, when I asked to see that, they would not show that to me. The big thing, the big issue this morning is that this is what the state police were looking for, is if anyone was brandishing a firearm, meaning pointing it towards someone, threatening anyone in the crowd or in the surrounding area, then arrests would be made. Now, Michigan is a open carry state, and there is no law on the books that says that someone cannot walk on the grounds of the Capitol, the exterior, with the firearm. And so that's why they're allowed to do that. Now, if they try to go into the building, major issue. But to get back to what I was originally saying, pouring rain, hour and a half of speakers, essentially saying, Governor Gretchen Whitmer, you have no constitutional right to put these shelter in place orders. You have no constitutional right to shut down our businesses. And, we need to get back to work, and we want our lives back. That was the message from the majority of these protesters.
So what is your sense about how the governor is dealing with this? How other Michiganders are treating these protesters and this protest movement?
Well, I think she's doing what her constituents are telling her to do, and she's listening to the science. That's what she's saying. Okay. Of course, we requested a one-on-one interview with her yesterday or today or even tomorrow morning, and was told that she didn't have the time. I would have liked to have asked that question to her, because I mean, you see quotes in other places where she's, making comments, and that's great, but I would like to hear it so I could personally report it. But from what I can tell, and I talked to the mayor of Lansing, who works with her and has been working with her for the past 2 months, and he's on board with the steps and the processes to reopen. His biggest concern right now, which is I think her biggest concern, is the fact that what they don't want is more people getting sick. And Michigan is up there, number 4 in total cases. I believe number 7 in total deaths. So there is clearly scientific concern. But the bottom line, I mean, for Michiganders, to your point, from the ground, from the citizen, is that their paychecks are not occurring. Most of them. I mean, this is a rural state. This is obviously a state with several main cities: Detroit, Lansing, Grand Rapids, and restaurants are shut. Economy is shut. The mayor of Lansing, in just 2 months, has lost $12.5 million. And he told me on camera, this will be in a story that will come out later tonight on WashingtonPost.com. He told me on camera yesterday evening that he feels that not only Lansing, but other cities and towns across America are going to need a federal bailout, because there's no way they're coming back out of this. So the concern is it's not even concern anymore, to be honest with you, from the ground. It is anxiety and panic from people out there, because they just don't know what to do. When you don't have a job, what happens? Well, you might lose your home. You might lose a relationship you're in, and the trickle down. And so the reality of this is really intense. And it's hard to put a finger on where to begin on all this reporting, because the tentacles are so wide and so destructive that you have to sit back with a perspective and listen to every side. And I really think that as journalists, as we progress in covering this and informing the public, that should be our goal, to really listen and feel the humanity here, because that's what the story is right now.
A totally different geographic place you've been reporting from, but one that's also struggling is the US-Mexico border and
Mm.
how food banks are trying to help people. There are a lot of families in need, a lot of unemployment. What did you hear from people in the El Paso region and the wider region?
Yeah, I mean, great point, Libby. The food banks in El Paso a couple weeks ago were 3 to 6 miles long. Just outrageous. I put a drone up because I didn't believe it actually because I was being told this and I'm like, wait a second. So I put the drone up. Sure enough, you know, the drone went for a couple miles, and that's about as far as you can take it. But you could see in the distance how far these lines went. And you know the thing, you know, El Paso is already a city with you know, a very impoverished residents. I mean, this is not a lucrative area by any means. And many of the people come across from Juarez, Mexico, over to work during the day and they go back. And, you know, of course, all that has been shut down due to the coronavirus. And El Paso officials were very concerned about the fact that the numbers out of Juarez, Juarez is 2.2 million people, the numbers out of there were much lower than that they thought were real. So they weren't believing those numbers. So they were trying to make sure that border was even tighter. But yeah, I mean, I spoke to a woman in El Paso who has two little kids. She was waiting on the check, the stimulus check, or what we call it, that was supposed to get and it was sent to a sort of like an HR block. But it was supposed to be sent to her house, and then it was returned to the federal government. So, you know, 5 weeks into the pandemic, she had $200 left. I asked her, I said, you know, with all due respect, how much money do you have? She said, I've got $200. You know, whether you have kids or not, you can't live off $200. So what does she do? Where does her life go at this point? And that's so many people, not just El Paso, but all over the country. You know, what is the plan? How do we all maneuver through this? It's the $1 trillion question.
Robert, as you've been traveling the country for these many weeks now, is there an evolving attitude or a change in how people are treating their personal safety? You know, are they using masks? Are you sensing some patterns and trends in people becoming sort of more aware and thoughtful about how to stay safe, or are people relaxing their guard?
Yeah, that is a great question. So in the beginning of my travels, there were definitive fear, palpable fear. I was afraid. I could feel it from everyone I was around, whether they were staying in a hotel or people that I was interviewing. There was a shake, sort of a shake of the hand, like, oh my gosh, I don't know where this is going. We all really need to be careful. You know, you walk down the street, people would kind of go like that. And over the weeks in traveling the country, I will say every state and town has its own identity within COVID-19, meaning its own feel to it. Though I will say this, masks have become prevalent pretty much everywhere I go. That you know, you really can't walk into a grocery store or a public place without the mask. Though I will say, in Atlanta Metro, where I live, not seeing a whole lot of that right now. Not a whole lot of the mask wearing. I mean, it's occasional, but then up here, for example, you know, everyone has the mask on. Not at the protest today, but you go into a grocery store or a hotel, and so I think the fear factor is still there, but I think what it's done is it's gone from the health issue to what am I going to do with my life financially? How am I going to raise my kids? How am I going to pay for my apartment, my house? You know, I'm worried still about myself, but now I look, you know, on my iPhone, on my checking account, and I'm like, oh dear God, that is the feeling I'm getting from people at this time. So again, I mean, I feel so badly for everyone that I talk to out there, and I wish there's something more that could be done to reassure everyone, because this is the present, and our future is going to depend on how we all move through this emotionally and physically in the coming months and gosh, even years. So I'm at a bit of a loss of words, to be honest with you, at this point.
Well, you've covered so many stories over the years, so I think it probably takes a lot for you to get to a point where you're at a loss for words, Robert. So that's certainly significant. I just want to ask you before we let you go, what next? Do you know what state you'll go to next? What the next story you'll chase is?
Yeah, we're looking at the state of Kentucky because of Appalachia, and there's certainly areas there that are in need before the pandemic, and now where are they? And then Tennessee's another state. Nashville being such a mecca for international tourism, much like Las Vegas. We're going to explore that and look at the restaurant industry and hospitality industry there, and the music industry, the culture. How does the culture come back? Another important thing as we move forward here. And then after that, I don't know. I like to look at this as organically, and a lot of these spots I've hit have been somewhat organic, meaning it's not, we're not necessarily picking spots per se. We're looking at, what's happening in this town, what is relevant, and what does the public need to see and hear from these places? Because every place has a different story, and some are just iconic to America, like Las Vegas or Nashville, and even El Paso. So it just depends. I kind of keep my eyes and ears open, and I use a lot of sources as well. I get phone calls from people I know around the country that say, I think you need to check this out. And then sure enough, we'll go check it out. And that's the key.
Robert Ray, it's so good to see you, and it's great to see your reporting. So thank you. We'll see how many states you hit over the next couple of weeks and months. Robert Ray, contributor for the Washington Post, on his 20th state, reporting on coronavirus and all the effects. And you can find his reporting at WashingtonPost.com. Thanks so much for being with us from your hotel room somewhere.
It's my honor. Thank you, Libby. Great to see you. Appreciate the time very much. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks so much to all of you for watching this special report. It is, really important to see these journalists who are so often behind the camera or have their pen and their pad and they're writing things down, to hear them tell their stories. I'm glad they were able to take a moment and share their experiences and what they've been seeing with us. We'll be back next week, Tuesday and Thursday, 3:00 Eastern time is when we are live, but you can also watch these after the fact. You can find them on the Washington Post's channel on YouTube, and subscribe while you're there. You can click the subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube, and you'll get notified of events or programming that we're doing. And of course, you're welcome to subscribe to the Washington Post to support the work of all those journalists that you just saw speaking today. I'm Libby Casey, and I hope you are healthy and well, and I look forward to talking with you next week.